Okay, welcome everybody to week 5. This is a fun chapter, I like to think, and I added some really good stuff this week to supplement the content from the textbook, which admittedly can be dry at times. So just to note, I am still grading your papers. I hope to have those done by the end of the week. And I was reading your discussions from last week and they were fantastic. So I do really look forward to seeing what you guys come up with this week. So first to start, our agenda for today is we're going to go over the nature of language, appreciating the power of words, the use and abuse of language, and how to create positive communications. So first thing, language is symbolic. As it is, language is made of symbols that we give meaning to, right? So in the class, we talk about language being, in English, you might say barn, but that might not be the same. Those letters may not be the same in other languages, like in the Dutch or Portuguese or Greek. So we definitely give meaning to those symbols. If you go into the example that I have on our module for this week, I use Ross and Monica in Friends. Ross and Monica as children didn't want to get in trouble by their parents, but they also wanted to show their displeasure with one another. So rather than giving each other the middle finger, they find a new and creative way to flip each other off. This is something that you'll notice comes up once it's introduced in the show. It comes up throughout the show. So I think that's really funny. And go ahead and give that video. It's a very short video. Give it a watch and you just see how many times their new way of flipping the bird really does come up. Also, going into it, language is also arbitrary for the most part. Most words only have arbitrary connections to the meanings, meaning that it's whatever we as the user of that language choose for them to mean. The only exception is onomatopoeias, which are sounds of their words. So meow, splash, things like that. In the Friends example, to a non-Friends watcher, if you've never seen the show, tapping your fists together could mean nothing to you or mean something completely different. And that just goes to show that it's language is arbitrary and it's us that puts meanings to those words. That being said, once we do give meaning to those words, language is intended to be, it has a governing body of rules. There's 4 of them that we look through in this chapter, and it's phonological rules, syntactic rules, semantic, and pragmatic rules. So phonological rules is the correct pronunciation, which I think is ironic because I have a hard time pronouncing some of these words. Different languages have different phonetic rules and therefore have different pronunciations for the same word. Something that may come up a lot is maybe the word croissant. In English, we pronounce it croissant, but in the French language, where they have softer meaning or softer pronunciations of certain letters, and I'm going to butcher it anyways, but they would say croissant, and they wouldn't say the A-N-T. They don't really say a hard R for the croissant. So phonological rules dictate how different languages pronounce the same words. Syntax, on the other hand, is the way we put the sentence together. I was not a good Spanish or French student, but I did take those classes. And in the Spanish language, they tend to put the signifier after the noun. The example in the textbook had the red card, which in English we put red in front of card. But in Spanish, and again, I apologize to Spanish speakers because I will butcher the example, but la tarjeta roja, I think I did that right. But you see that they put roja, which is red, at the end of the noun. So syntax rules depend from culture to culture, from language to language. And then you have semantics, and that's just the meaning of individual words. The textbook uses car, for example. So we give car the meaning it has. It's not an onomatopoeia. You don't look at the word and if you're not familiar with the English language, you might not look at that word and say, oh, that's an automobile. But because in the English language, we've associated the word car with automobile, we immediately know when somebody says car to think of some sort of vehicle. Now, this is something that can change too, even in the English language. I say car, generally speaking, I drive an SUV. But car for me is more of a blanket statement. So even within the same language, you see rules technically broken because it's individual words that we're providing meaning to. And we're never, as a human English speaking culture, on the same page because of our influence, whether that be culture, gender, or whatever our external influences are. And then you have pragmatic rules. And that's using social and cultural cues to determine the meaning of words. This is kind of where tone is really important. We'll talk about sarcasm and humor later. But if I said, oh, it's really nice to meet you, my tone signifies that I'm intentionally and genuinely excited to meet the person. But if I maybe roll my eyes and say, oh, it's nice to meet you, you may get a completely different meaning from those exact same words. So the pragmatic rule is that we have to use social and cultural cues to determine the meaning of the words that are being said. And that is like those 4 language rules, which are phonological, syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic. Going into less rules, but more layers of language. Language has layers of meaning. So we have the denotative. Sorry. Again, for me, I break rules all the time. The denotative language or meaning is that it's the literal definition, the dictionary definition of what the word means. But then you have the connotative, which is the meaning that we give the word's implications based on how we see it. So, for example, you can use home. A home, by literal definition, is a shelter. But home, in a connotative meaning, could be a safe space. It may not be your physical house or a shelter, but to me, home could be a person. My husband, for example. There's different layers, and we go through that. Oftentimes, connotative comes up a lot more than the literal meaning because us as humans, we tend to sway towards emotion more. Now you have the semantic triangle of things. And in this case, you're looking at this triangle, and on the top you have a picture of a physical home, right? That is the referent. That is what you think the word, or what the word is defined as. And then you have the symbol, which is the actual written word itself, HOME. And then you have the reference, where you see a picture of family and togetherness, you would say. So the same word has one denotative meaning, but we all have different connotative meanings because of people who use them and their experiences. So that reference could look different for different people. And of course, the referent can be as well. So the referent is a house, but what the house looks like to different people is dependent on where you live. But the symbol home will always be spelled HOME in the English language, I guess, unless they decide to change it, but that's not the case. And then again, the reference. For me, I told you home, that picture could possibly be my husband or my animals, my little fur babies, my mom, because that's how I see the word home. And With the additional layers of language, we also have loaded language. And this is with the intent. Loaded language, you're thinking of words like cancer, peace, family, freedom is what the textbook uses. And it's the intent to that they use words that hold strongly positive, strongly negative connotative meanings. The denotative meanings of loaded language are usually emotionally neutral. Like a home, by definition, the little definition, doesn't carry any emotion. We also see a lot of this, though, in advertising. So, limited edition, right? It makes you feel as if you need to buy it and you need to buy it now. All natural. If you're on a health kick, which I feel like I am every 3 months, all natural feels like the better option, the healthier option that you're making. When in reality, they may make more of these, or it may be a remake of something or something that isn't intended or isn't necessarily limited edition, but it incites an emotion in you that makes you feel as if you need to buy it. So you'll see a lot of that in advertising. That's loaded language. So how do you spot loaded language? First of all, emotional appeal. Look for words that trigger strong positive or negative feelings. The connotation, consider the applied meaning and associated judgments with that, not just the literal definition of it. And then look for polarization. Be wary when you see language that creates an us versus them mentality, or extreme positions. Those words, that language, that's loaded language, and its intention is to make you feel as if like you're strongly agreeing or strongly disagreeing with something. And then going back to some of the language that the textbook uses, cancer, by definition, cancer is an illness, right? But we use the word cancer to refer to strongly negative things, like criminals are a cancer to society. So think of it like that, and how loaded language can impact the way you see things. And then language, going into our next slide here, language varies in clarity as well. Some language is ambiguous, and language varies in abstraction. So ambiguous language has more than one meaning. Think about, I went to the bank. Generally, we would all understand you probably went to a financial institution, but the word bank can be defined multiple ways. Did you go to the riverbank? So the landing at the side of a river, or to go to the financial institution, the financial bank. And then another example, the goat is ready to eat. This one is a little more when we think of, there's an example of like, I ate with grandma, or I ate grandma, and then the punctuation saves grandma or something. I know it's a terrible way to explain this example, but in this one, the goat is ready to eat. Is the goat ready to be fed, or is it ready to be eaten? Is it cooked goat, or is it a very much so alive pet goat that you would need to feed? So that's what we think when we think about ambiguous language. If we were to write, carrots make nutritious snacks, you would understand that a carrot is more nutritious than maybe a bag of potato chips if you wanted a snack. However, if I were to write, mother makes nutritious snacks for her children, you'd understand that the mother prepares nutritious things for her children to eat. So it's a little bit more clear. However, now, if you put kids instead of carrots, and then omit the prepositional phrase where it says for her children at the end, and you just said kids make nutritious snacks, that could either mean kids prepared the snacks, or the kids themselves are snacks for someone or something to eat. So we save children by adding prepositions to make sure they don't get eaten. But also that just kind of shows you that language can be ambiguous. So into our next slide now, we're looking at the ladder of abstraction. It just shows levels and progress of ambiguity. So a living being, very abstract, right? It could be anything. It could be an animal. It could be a person, but it could also be, so now we're going down, right? So living being, abstract. Animal, a little less abstract, right? Now you can think, oh, well, maybe it's a dog. It could be a bear. It could be a lion. Now, but it couldn't be like a living organism, I guess plants are living, right? So it couldn't be living. Sorry, biology's not my strong suit, and yet I chose this example. Animal, of course, now we're eliminating the plants. But when you go down to mammal, you're eliminating some categories of animals. And then you go down to primate and you're eliminating even more, right? You're focusing on specific primates, right? And then you go down to Homo sapiens, which is fancy for human beings, right? Now we're like, okay, we've eliminated every other sort of mammal. We're talking about humans. But now are we talking about, what kind of human are we talking about? Okay, we're talking about male humans. Now are even more specific, more concrete. You can picture exactly what I'm looking at, right? Very basic vision of a man in your head. And then I could say my brother Tim, and that is most concrete. Hopefully you guys don't think of my brother Tim in any other way. If you're talking to somebody and you know their brother Tim, you know exactly what to picture. So again, that just goes with language being a ladder of abstraction from very vague to very specific. So this one's a little bit longer. We talk about language and how it has abstractions and rules, but it's also bound by context and culture. Sapir-Whorf, those are two different, what do you call them? Academic people. I'm an academic person. I can't remember the word. Oh my gosh, the word has absolutely escaped me. And see, this happens all the time. Language is hard. But there are two different theorists, so to speak, that created a hypothesis that says that with language, you have linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. They believed that if you didn't have a word for it in your language, that you couldn't experience it, and that's linguistic determinism. So if your language didn't have a word to describe the emotion of envy, how could you feel envious? Sapir and Whorf claim that you can't because of linguistic determinism. Because you don't have a word for envy, you can't feel it. On the flip side, but on the next point, linguistic relativity states that because a language shapes the way we see the world, certain languages utilize multiple words to describe what English might only have one word for. So Russians have two words for the color blue. It splits the color blue into dark blue and light blue. And studies showed that it actually helped them identify colors quicker than English speakers. So because language shapes the way we see the world, sometimes people see it quicker depending on how their language is set up as opposed to the English language. In an Inuit language in northern Canada, they have multiple words for our one word, snow. They're multiple singular words, right? Describe different types of snow. So where we would use adjectives to say wet snow, dry snow, heavy snow, they have different words to describe it just in a singular word. However, keep this in mind. This theory, this Sapir-Whorf theory or hypothesis, I apologize, has wildly been contested by researchers. Oh my gosh, the researchers. That's the word I was looking for. I could have looked at the screen. Oh my gosh. Sorry, I get onto tangents. Anyways, so there have been pushback that suggests that this hypothesis isn't entirely all-encompassing. Naysayers are arguing that you can feel emotion even though there's a word for it, or if you don't know a word for it. And they argue this because younger children still feel emotions, whether they know what they are or not. People with intellectual disabilities, people with illiteracy issues. So just because you can't say what it is, you can't describe it to others, you still very much feel it. So it's something that we do talk about, this hypothesis, but don't think that it's just end all be all. This is the way it is. Okay, so now we talked about the nature of language. Let's talk about the power of words. Um, we use words. Hmm. Oh, sorry, I was on the wrong slide. We use words to define us, right? Us specifically as humans, right? So names, think about our names. They define and differentiate us. I know who's who in my class based on your name. Especially in online classes where I only get to see a name. But based on that, we can also make assumptions about people based on their names. Think about William and Billy. Billy is a short form of William, but William feels more mature. Billy feels a little bit childish. But at the same time, maybe as a child, they went as Billy. People called him Billy. It was William was too adult to go by at the time. But then as they grew into it, they grew into William, and maybe those childhood friends still call them Billy. My name legally is Allison Marie, but the only person who calls me that is my mom when she's mad. And yes, still in my 30s, my mom can still call me at any time and be mad at me and call me Allison Marie, along with all the other names I have. But in childhood, I went by Allie. So most of my family calls me that, just because that's how they grew up knowing me. It wasn't until my 20s that I preferred to be called Allison because it felt more mature. Still didn't want to be called Allison Marie because it takes too long to say. But Allison felt like my identity in my 20s, and it's something I carry through till now. I know a lot of people might call me Professor Kanuha or Mrs. Kanuha. I'm still more recently getting used to that, as I've only been married for about a year and a half, and I'm still attached to Bento, which is also a name that people called me because it was my maiden name. It was my last name. It was easy to say. So that, though, if somebody called me Bento, that would signify that there was an even more personal relationship, that somebody felt that they could make their own nickname for me, even though it's part of my name. And I could differentiate, like, oh, if I can't see a person, but I hear them call me Bento, I know that that person knows me on a deeper level because it's a personal thing. But naming practices vary from sex, ethnicity, religion, age, and my name, Alison Marie, comes from a European Catholic heritage. But it's mixed with a little bit, I would say, mixed with a little bit of whitewashing. So every woman in my family was born with the first name Maria, and then they had a second name, and that's how everyone went by. So my mother's name is Maria Gisela, and she goes by Gisela. Her sister's name is Maria Anna. She goes by Anna. So they were born in Portugal and I was born in Canada. And so rather than give me Maria Allison, they said Allison and then Marie, which seemed a little more French, which Canada has French influence, but they still kept with that tradition. And it grows, right? So they only grew up in that European Catholic heritage, but I grew up in the Canadian European Catholic. Now all these different ethnicities, cultures, religions are mixing. And that's how Allison Marie comes about. Now let's talk about, what about when taking last names? Last names create, I mean, for the most part, or historically, women have taken their spouses' last names in most cultures. Not all cultures, this varies. So I had an identity crisis going from Allison Bento to Allison Kanuha, not only because it's so much harder to say Kanuha, but the connection that I have to my maiden name. I already explained that my maiden name is something that people called me as a nickname. And so to go and hear somebody say that even more so solidifies that they would have to have known me in a past life to know that Bento is an acceptable nickname. So people have connections to their names. It's how it differentiates us. And people worry, like, well, what do I call somebody? And I think that the best part about being an empathetic and kind person and wanting to know what to call somebody is you should never be worried as long as you ask. if you ask and you make a conscious effort to call that person by what they want to be called, then that's progress, a lot more progress than some may be granted. Some kindness, some people may not be granted. So you may call me Allison. You may call me Mrs. Kanuha, Professor Kanuha, Big Al. That one's a joke, but if you do call me that, then I guess that's fine. But what I'm saying is you can call me all those things because those are things that define me. Those are the names that define me as a person. That one was a little bit long, but on the next slide, now we talk about the persuasion of words. We use words to apply to people's emotions, their reasonability, but we also use them to let people gain trust in us. So we're applying to people, or we're appealing to people's ethos, pathos, and logos. You'll see this in a lot of communication classes as you come across them. So ethos, it relies on speakers' respectability, trustworthiness, and moral character. I'm talking to you to appeal to your ethos by showing you that I'm a trustworthy person. Now, if I appeal to your pathos, I'm relying on your emotions. I'm trying to pull on your heartstrings. Maybe I'm using some of that loaded language I mentioned. That may, however, if I use loaded language, put a dent in my trustworthiness or my moral character, depending on how I'm using it. And then my logo says, I'm appealing to your ability to reason. If I'm trying to persuade you, I'm hoping that you understand and can have a voice of reason of your own. So when we talk to persuade, we appeal to people's ethos, their pathos, and their logos. So now we talked about our ethos. We're talking about credibility. If we're consistently having uncredible conversations or saying things that aren't backed, we're losing power. Credibility is the extent to which others perceive us to be competent and worthy. So again, if we're spewing false, fake things, then people lose trustworthiness in us or trust in us. There are several types of language that can enhance or diminish our credibility. So we have equivocation. That's essentially beating around the bush, providing a roundabout answer. If somebody asks you a question that has a clear possibility for an answer and you beat around the bush consistently, people feel maybe as though you're hiding something. You'll see this a lot with many politicians from both sides. All the whole spectrum of politicians tend to beat around the bush when they don't want to answer the question, or maybe they just don't know the answer, but they feel as though if they don't answer it, they also lose credibility. Or if they answer it and say, I don't know, they also lose credibility. So it kind of goes back and forth. Weasel words. That's something. So for example of weasel words is, oh, well, people say that, or experts believe, but they don't actually have research to back it up. 4 out of 5 dentists. That is a very iconic weasel words, set of weasel words, because we don't know how many dentists they studied, right? 4 out of 5. What if they only talked to 5? That's not a very big sample size. But if they did a larger, maybe they interviewed 1,000 dentists, and that 4 out of 5 is now a smaller, digestible version of, when you simplify math and you go, oh, like 1 of 2, 4 of 5. But we don't know that because they didn't provide that research. So these things are all considered like weasel words, and the intent is to evade responsibility. So a company might say, customers report that the product is effective, rather than all customers find it effective. And this allows them to distance themselves from any negative feedback. It's used to make weak arguments seem stronger. You can do that by adding terms like, it is thought. A writer can give an impression of an expert opinion without having to name any expert. It also creates false impressions. Phrases like, one of a kind. And it's often used in sales and advertising because it's subjective and difficult to prove. And then you have allness statements. Allness statements is a variation of weasel words. It's providing all or nothing statements without research or context. So it's, again, kind of giving you a little bit of that loaded language where you're like, you're all dentists believe this, or no dentist thinks this is a good idea. I'm stuck on the dentist idea. And then you have cliches, which are, I'm trying to find like a good example of a cliche. I like Google. Cliche example. Guys, I don't use cliches very often. Oh, perfect. All that glitters is not gold. And so, or every cloud is a silver lining. And so if you feel like you're losing an argument, you might just throw that in it. And people who agree with that cliche, if they didn't understand what you were saying, they're like, oh, well, if it means this, then yes, I agree with it. So they're just kind of creating a false impression of what you're talking about. And so, yeah, so cliches, and these all, again, if used with good intent, can be positive, but oftentimes are used in negative ways, and they can weaken your argument. Language also expresses affection and intimacy. Affectionate language establishes and helps maintain relationships. And giving, and studies do show that giving and receiving affection are good for our health. And that's not just me throwing out a random study show, because if you think about it, people use the love language, right? The 5 love languages, and some of them are actual words and some of them aren't. But if we think of words of affirmation, that's one of my love languages. And it's a way of hearing the things that maybe you also see, right? So the 5 love languages generally are gifts, acts of service, words of affirmation, physical touch, and did I say acts of service? Acts of service? 5 love, but there's 5 of them. And so maybe they give me a gift because that's the way they think that I hear that I'm loved, but I don't feel it, because my receiving love language is words of affirmation. I want to hear, oh honey, I love you, or I think you look good today, or I think you're doing a great job. So words have a lot of power in intimate relationships as well. And on the flip side, if you're consistently tearing down your partner, that also impacts it. So words, along with intimate relationships, can also provide comfort and healing in relationships that are not necessarily intimate, right? So we use language to comfort people in need, and we use language to comfort ourselves. I always tell myself, I look in the mirror and I go, you're doing a great job today, or I did my best, and it helps comfort me. I have severe anxiety, and so a lot of the times I'm consistently going through positive words of affirmation for myself. But I try to use it too when I grade for you guys. I know sometimes it sucks getting a grade that isn't what you want, but I try to help. I generally speaking, I try to do like a constructive criticism sandwich, right? I'll tell you something you did really well, and then I'll tell you what you need to work on, but then I'll finish with something you did really well. If you go back to think about that impressions we talked about last week, where your first impression is really important and your most recent impression is so important, right? You still pay attention to the stuff in the middle, but the things you remember are the last 2 things. So if I need to give you some sort of criticism, it's best to give it to you in a way that you don't feel attacked or belittled or sad. And there's plenty that you guys do every day in my class that I see as positive. So I'm always going to tell you that. Great job at doing this. Work on this. I can't wait to see this. And I try to actively do that. So because I know the power of language, I know the power of words, and lack thereof. Sometimes if we don't say the words, it can create hurt feelings. When talking about hurt feelings, there's also the use and abuse of language. And this is something that I mentioned to last week, 2 weeks ago. First of all, we use humor, and humor generally violates expectations of what you expect somebody to say. It can enhance communication by putting people at ease, diffusing a stressful situation, reinforcing intimacy, but it can also be harmful, demeaning to social or cultural groups, offensive, harmful, harassing. So if you think back to that example that we talked about either last week or the week before about Chris Rock and the humor he used in his Oscars monologue, right? So he used it with the intent that he thought it was funny, it was going to put others at ease, it was going to make people laugh, it was going to reinforce the intimacy in the room. But it didn't. It was harmful to some, right? We saw his reaction, Will Smith's reaction to Chris Rock's humor by him slapping Chris Rock, right? He didn't feel it was a good joke. He felt it was demeaning. And so we always have to be mindful of how we use humor. My personal brand is self-deprecating humor. Using self-deprecating humor helps me alleviate tension in situations. But I also use it to show others that it's okay not to be perfect. And I do that a lot with when I'm first meeting friends, to show them that I am not perfect. And if that helps them feel more comfortable opening up to me, if they feel embarrassed about certain things, I am a human example of embarrassment. But I try not to let it bug me too much. And I want to show them that it's okay not to be perfect and I'm safe to be around. I'm safe for you to be yourself around. So you'll always see me trying to make some sort of self-deprecating humor. Other uses and abuses of language when we talk about euphemisms. Generally speaking, when I use the word euphemism, a lot of people add like a sexual connotation to it. But in reality, euphemisms are just vague, mild expressions symbolizing something that's more harsh and blunt. So yes, we can use them in sexual conversations, but that's not the only use of euphemisms. So if you think of the word died, when I used to work in news, people would get mad at me all the time. They said, because I said, oh, the victim died as a result of this. And people say, that is just such a harsh way of saying this. Or I said, oh, the victim is dead. Well, that's such a harsh way of saying it. Couldn't you be nicer about it? And they're essentially asking for a euphemism. So you also see, in a way to lighten that, you can say passed away, succumbed to their injuries. Now, if you think of somebody who was fired, right? Fired from your job. Oh no, I was let go. I'm no longer with the company. So thinking of ways, this is another one, a grosser example, praying to the porcelain altar. I had to look up some other euphemisms that may help with this example. But that, in case anyone was wondering, is vomiting. So that is what I'm saying. So euphemisms are just ways to cushion something that may be harder to digest. But that being said, euphemisms require a certain level of understanding in culture, like cultural understanding. So a non-native speaker may not understand a euphemism or may take it literally without the additional context. So praying to the porcelain altar to some other cultures who don't know that means vomiting may truly believe that you are praying to a deity on a porcelain altar that they've never seen before. So euphemisms are just a way to provide or to talk about sensitive topics. It can, though, desensitize us to important issues, because if we're consistently seeing things from a softer perspective, we're losing the reality of it, that it's still a very serious situation. So if somebody passed away, you have to remember, that is it. That is death that we're talking about. It's used to make you feel better, but you should still understand that why are these people dying? What violence are we seeing, or illness that we should be researching cures for and stuff like that. So again, use and abuse. Now, and I talk about this next slide this slide in my public speaking class a lot. There's other ways that we can use and abuse language, and that's slang. And it's, for most people, slang, you've used slang in your life. And it's just informal words understood. And generally, usually by specific groups. So I always say that certain generations create their own slang. The current Gen Z and Alpha generations have created slang that I have no idea what they mean. But I remember as a millennial creating my own slang. On the flip side, I think of these two, slang and jargon, kind of like a scale, right? So on one side of the scale, you have slang, which is a breakdown of words that we already have defined in a dictionary. And then on the other side, you have jargon, and that's associated with particular occupations or professions or categories, right? And both of them can signify or can point out or who is in the know and who's on the outs. So in groups and out groups. And if you don't know the slang or jargon, it alienates the outsiders. So like I said, on one side you have slang, on the other side you have jargon, and in the middle you have just layman's terms, which is generally usually just the general word, the definition. I now really would love you to watch the SNL skit that I put on this current week's module. And it's the Gen Z hospital. I will tell you right now, I watched it and there are so many terms that I don't even know, but it's Gen Z and that's just where we're at now. It's funny. It's a funny way to point out that slang changes everywhere. I still use lit, but lit to somebody maybe older than me might actually believe that I turned something on, I lit something on fire. When in reality, I'm saying lit because, oh, that's really good. That's the bomb for other generation slang. So yes, we use and abuse language all the time, but sometimes it's seemingly less harmless, but you have to consider how your slang or jargon can alienate others. And oftentimes people who use jargon, either do it without knowing, or when they do it and their intention is to make them feel superior to others. Now, this is something that as a journalist, I had burned into my brain. If you go through journalism school, they'll tell you this until they're blue in the face. Another abuse of language is libel and slander. So they're defamatory statements about others. They differ because libel is in print or some sort of fixed medium that's published and cannot be fixed, right? Is permanent. Or I shouldn't say permanent, but it's like it's something that can be once printed, like it's harder to take back, right? Slander, on the other hand, is the defamatory statement, but it's made out loud, so you're speaking it, and it has to be within earshot. Like I shouldn't say you can slander, but like slander can't happen if nobody hears it. You're just saying it to yourself. That's just self-care. So defamation is language is harmful to a person's image or reputation. And whether it's print, libel, or verbal slander, it can have legal implications. So we always have to be very mindful of what we say and where we type it. And this is why I always tell people that when you put things on social media, it is out there. If you put it on the internet, it is so much harder to take back. So you always have to be so mindful of what you say online. And because you could find yourself in a libel or slander lawsuit. And then, of course, we probably all know this, profanity. It's rude or obscene language. We also refer to it as its euphemism, which is curse words, swear words. But it's context specific. So sometimes it's intended to put people at ease because you're chill. You don't care about swears. Some cultures, again, this is a culture thing. And I will not say it because this is a bad word. The C word is often used in culture in like the UK, and they use it as like a buddy term, or even if they use it as a non-buddy term, they use it so often that it's kind of lose its meaning. And swears or profanities are sometimes intended to insult people, like calling them names. But again, going back to context specific, if I use the word bitch, for example, that is also a term that defines female dogs. But in profanity and in context, I could be referring to insult somebody. if you're me, me and my best friend often refer to each other like that in a endearing and loving way. I don't know how it came about. It's just something we call each other now. Some people say that profanity is like, or some people see profanity as being less intellectual. And sometimes there's just no other words for me that define than a swear word, but I have to always be mindful of where I'm using it and the context I'm using it in. And lastly, for use and abuse of language with hate speech. So hate speech is profanity, but with the intention to degrade or intimidate people based on specific personal characteristics, such as their sex, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability status, political or moral views. In the United States right now, there are laws restricting hate speech, but it varies by state to state. There's also entire countries that agree on hate speech laws restricting the use of it and having consequences. An example of hate speech that may not be obvious or may be obvious depending on how you see it. When COVID-19 happened, initially people referred to it as the China virus. And that's because, well, for many reasons, but people believed that it originated, or research had showed that it originated back to Wuhan, China. However, by using that hate speech, by calling it the China virus, it became dangerous to Asian Americans here in the United States, receiving hurtful comments, physical abuse, mental abuse, just hateful actions towards them, and they had nothing to do with it. And again, we see Asian Americans, and we call this, and people call it the China virus. There's plenty of different groups of Asians, and people generalized and stereotyped, and it became dangerous to be Asian in the United States at that time. So again, hate speech, something that we have to be mindful. I mean, it's hate speech for me, it generally is more intentional, more malicious than maybe profanities or libel or slander. But it's something that we have to be mindful of and make sure that when we speak, we're doing it with informed opinions, kindness, and empathy. Okay, so we go from hate speech into how do we create positive communication climate. Pardon me. Using confirming messages, recognition, acknowledgement, endorsement. And this goes back to those love languages that I was kind of mentioning, but also just how you communicate with others that aren't just your loved ones. You can have conversations with people, and sometimes you feel maybe it's hard to let them know you're listening because you feel as if you might not know what to say. Part of it is just the listening part, and acknowledge that you're listening. So if you recognize it, you provide recognition. I recognize you. You matter. You can acknowledge them. If that looks like asking for someone's opinion about something, about their ideas or feelings, about something, acknowledging that they exist in this world and that you're reaching out to them because they matter, but also active listening to when they tell you these things, or they ask, or when they tell you their opinions and feelings. And then endorsing another person, agreeing with somebody and what they're saying. These are all ways, recognizing, acknowledging, endorsing. These are all ways that we can communicate positivity with one another. Now, we also want to avoid things just as much as we want to include them. And that is impervious responses, verbal abuse, generalized complaining, irrelevant responses, or impersonal responses. And this sometimes can happen without our knowledge. I think back as I was looking through this chapter for how to bring this content to you. Sometimes we use this with our parents, or with people, our siblings, or people that we hold our dearest because we feel like we've put in all the footwork already. but positive communication never has an end. So impervious responses, that's, I don't care about you enough to even recognize your existence. Verbal abuse, it's pretty much what it sounds like, using words to hurt others. General complaining, you never think about anyone but yourself, or why can't you be more like your brother? And this is general, like we're generalized, right? So that person probably does think about others, but in this one specific situation, you just feel as if they can't think about anybody else. And you're generalizing an entire person's existence to one situation. These last two is what I think when I think about sometimes as a teenager when I was talking to my mom. Irrelevant responses, disregarding their message and saying something irrelevant after. This kind of goes in with, it's not active listening. You're listening to respond. You're listening to make your own response, but you're not listening to understand. And it's so important when we're trying to have positive communication. And then impersonal responses, if maybe somebody's rambling on and you just want the conversation to be done, sometimes you might just go, well, life's a struggle. If somebody's confiding in you about depression or having a bad day, oh, well, it happens to everyone. It's impersonal. It's not acknowledging that they told you something, that they needed you in that moment. And so having those responses, thinking about how the other person might feel, right? Think about how that kind of response could hinder a relationship. And then we also want to avoid making others feel defensive. Evaluation versus, so I'm going to go through these and then I'm going to discuss them further. So evaluation versus description. So evaluation would be, this is the worst article you've ever written. But descriptive, being descriptive, there are other opportunities for improvement in this article. So think about that. The first one is it feels more like an attack, whereas the second one is there's room for improvement, but they're also that statement acknowledges that there's good things in this article. So that's evaluation versus descriptive. Control versus problem orientation. The control-oriented messages manipulate others to act a specific way, whereas problem-oriented encourages more of a collaborative thinking. So control-oriented might be, you can't watch TV right now, my show's on. But problem-oriented might be, let's figure out a way to watch what we both want. And then strategy versus spontaneity. Strategic messages withhold information in an attempt to control the listener, whereas spontaneous messages express thoughts and desires openly without some hidden agenda underneath it. So this happens often to me, or to other people, right? Like you want to ask them, hey, what are you doing next weekend? And if someone asks me that, I'm like, oh, are they going to ask me to hang out? What's going to be? And then I overthink it. And then I tell them, or sometimes if it's somebody I don't want to hang out with, I might lie at first. And I know that's not good communication, but it's honest communication. So they might say, are you busy this weekend? In a strategic response or a strategic message. But in spontaneous, they say, I'm planning a hike next Saturday. Do you want to come? Then that puts the option in the listener's court to understand what the message is right from the jump. And there's no hidden secondary message that you're hoping your response, your feedback gives to them. And then you have neutrality versus empathy. So a neutral statement implies the lack of concern. It's just, again, it's neutral. It's not very empathetic. But an empathetic statement conveys concern about others' feelings. So neutral could be, not everything goes the way you want. That's life. But empathetic could be, I'm sorry that your plans fell through. You must be disappointed. Acknowledging that it's a sucky thing to happen. And then you have superiority versus equality, which a message of superiority encourages division. It's very us versus them language. Um, and it lacks inclusiveness, whereas equality emphasizes inclusiveness and minimizes differences in status between others. So superiority could look like you don't know what you're doing, and that creates a divide between that person speaking and the person listening. Whereas equality could look like, well, that's an interesting approach. I've never thought about the situation like that before. Because in all honesty, are there multiple ways to do the same thing? And that way you're not creating divide over something that may be very minuscule. And then finally, you have certainty versus provisionalism. So certainty or messages of certainty offer inflexible conclusions, like this is absolutely no room for debate how we do things. But provisionalism messages offers flexibility in hope of creating conversation, opening dialogue, and finding new ideas. So certainty might look like you're wrong, but provisional might look like, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Is it possible the source of your information is mistaken? That one's a little bit tough because then you're still blaming maybe their source, and that they could feel as though their source, you don't believe that they're a good researcher. But it's all about being intentionally positive. As long as you're not doing anything with malice and trying to be malicious and pull people down, whether it be through evaluation messages, control, strategy, neutrality, superiority, or certainty, if you're not doing those things, you're doing a good job as a speaker or as using language. So continuing on though, providing effective feedback is super important. Non-evaluation feedback is also very important. How many times have you had a conversation maybe with a significant other, a parent, a friend, and they listen, but then they give advice and you're like, well, I'm not looking for a solution right now. So non-evaluation feedback is just that. It's just to be heard. You just want to be heard, not given advice to or offered a solution. And so sometimes in those conversations where you're listening, there's things you can do to acknowledge that you're listening without providing a solution. Probing could be one, and that's just to ask more questions. If somebody has an issue, ask follow-up questions to acknowledge that you've listened and you want to hear more. Offering support. This must be really hard for you. You have my support with whatever decision you make. Paraphrasing. And I do this a lot when you have maybe a disagreement. Say what they're saying to make sure, A, that you've heard it correct, but also sometimes when people say it, they don't understand the way it comes across. So they have to hear it from a different voice. So paraphrasing can sound like, okay, so you're saying that you feel as though this is not a fair trade. So paraphrasing what they've said back to them. And then so that's non-evaluative feedback, right? That's just responding to acknowledge that you've listened. But evaluative feedback can be providing praise, congratulating them on the good. I feel like we don't do this enough. And then criticizing constructively. I mentioned this earlier. I like to use the critique sandwich, good, bad, good. No one likes to get just bad news all the time. And there are good things about everybody out there if you look hard enough. So when giving critique, try providing something they did good, something they didn't improve on, and then something they did good again. Going back to that idea of first impression and recency's impression. Own your thoughts and feelings as well. I statements claim ownership of what the communicator is saying. I am mad right now. Whereas you statements shift that responsibility to the other person, and that's not necessarily taking responsibility, right? You are making me mad. And then this is very important, and it happens a lot in politics, and it's happening a lot in modern discourse and conversations. And I think this is something that we can all learn from. Separating opinions from factual claims. So factual claims can be verified with evidence and shown to be true or false. So, example, candidate C has more experience in government. That can be proven if you do research and history of what that candidate did versus the others. That's provable information. Opinions, however, express personal judgments that we can agree or disagree with, but aren't necessarily true or false in an absolute sense. So candidate L is a better choice for the future. While you may believe that, and it might be true in your subjective view, it's not necessarily absolute. It's not necessarily true or false in an absolute sense, because we don't have a rubric for how to define what better choice for our future would look like. So it's really important that when we have conversations and we have open debate, that we're making sure that we're standing on factual claims rather than opinions, because that's what makes strong speakers. And then, of course, creating positive climates in electronically mediated communication is hard. We expect things to be immediate, and it's not sometimes. A message can happen, or an entire conversation can happen over days. But it's also important not to use your online communication as a shield. We call them keyboard warriors, things you can say online because you have no fear about what it would look like, or about the repercussions. And then pay attention to autocorrect. Obviously, we want to make sure that our message has full credibility. And if we're not taking the time to edit, it may look like we don't care. Reflecting on the message instead of reacting. Take a minute, read it. It might make you mad in that moment, but don't send the message response when you're full of emotion. Take a minute, take a few, read it again. Maybe you misconstrued the message. Oftentimes, the way that we say things over text can absolutely be misconstrued because it misses out on key pieces of communication: body language, tone, eye contact, your relationship in that moment with the person. So take a minute, reread, ask follow-up questions, do the non-evaluative feedback. And then this is something that is just always a good thing. Get permission before sharing other people's photos. Everything that you post online has a more intense sense of permanence. It's so much harder to take things offline once they've been put into the interweb. Some people may not want what they've shared with you in confidence to be online. So make sure you're getting permission every time you put something out there that's not directly yours. And that's what we have for this week's chapter. We talked about language. This is probably the longest I've ever talked in a lecture, but language is so important. It's a foundation for the way we communicate. So take a look at that chapter if you haven't read it and you're just at this point just listening to the PowerPoints. Take a look at the 2 videos that I posted. The discussion question this week is actually based on our additional reading, and our additional reading is a study that was conducted actually in my hometown of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And it was conducted with participants who were about college age kids, and their use of sarcasm and using sarcasm to save face necessarily. And so we learn through this study how the use of humor affects interpersonal relationships, or how they use it to impact interpersonal relationships. So that reading is directly connected to our discussion board question of this week. So take a look at that and let me know if you have any questions.